The fight for voting rights has been a long and painful one in the United States. In 1865, following a 4-year civil war, more than 250 years of African slavery ended in America with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. 3 years after that, the 14th Amendment granted former slaves citizenship rights and equal protection. But it wasn't until 1870 that the 15th Amendment ensured
the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
And it was still totally cool to deny people the right to vote on the basis of gender, and would be for another 50 years, by the way. But after 1890, former slave states in the South got to work trying to re-segregate their societies under so-called Jim Crow laws, named for a stereotypical black minstrel character, with legislation like the Louisiana Railway Separate Car Act.
Any passenger insisting on going into a coach or compartment to which, by race, he does not belong shall be liable to a fine of $25.
States of the old Confederacy also restricted ballot access for black male voters. They couldn't do it on racial grounds anymore, so they did it on the basis of wealth through poll taxes. If you couldn't pay the tax, you couldn't register to vote. Literacy tests were also used to deny the vote to poorly educated former slaves. And if taxes and tests weren't enough, some white election officials would just refuse to let a black man cast a ballot. The Democratic Party declared their primaries were whites only. And then there was widespread election violence and intimidation, including hundreds of lynchings by the likes of the Ku Klux Klan. And it worked. In the state of Louisiana in 1896, there were 130,000 registered black voters. 8 years later, at the election of 1904, that was reduced to just 1,342. Jim Crow laws and the segregationist myth of separate but equal access endured in much of the South for the next 60 years or so. Grandfather laws prevented anyone from registering to vote whose grandfather hadn't been enrolled, again, mostly affecting the descendants of slaves. When courts ruled that unconstitutional, black voters in Oklahoma were given just 11 days to enroll or be banned from voting for life. And it wasn't until the 1960s that things really began to change.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
Along with the Civil Rights Act, 1964 also saw the 24th Amendment finally ban poll taxes. 4 months later, there was record black turnout for the presidential election. 58% of almost 21 million eligible black voters, twice the level of any previous election. But there was still a massive regional divide. Outside the South, there was 72% black turnout. In the South itself, just 44% of black voters cast a ballot. And here is part of the reason why. Confusing literacy tests like this one, also from the state of Louisiana. In theory, it could be given to anyone who couldn't prove they'd completed the 5th grade, but in practice, it was mostly given to black people.
In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. What?
And get just one answer wrong, you couldn't vote. In other cases, black voters were told to recite the US Constitution from memory, 4,500 words of it. The brutal attack by Alabama state troopers and a white mob on John Lewis and his fellow voting rights campaigners in Selma on March 7, 1965, was seen on television screens across America and around the world. President Lyndon Johnson vowed to act.
It is wrong deadly wrong to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests and grandfather laws and provided federal oversight of voter registration in areas where fewer than 50% of the non-white population were registered to vote. And 9 states had to get federal approval to change their voting laws. And that held until 2013.
After nearly half a century, the U.S. Supreme Court pulled the plug today on federal supervision of 9 mostly southern states whose records on race relations were deemed a threat to minority voting rights.
At the time, Chief Justice John Roberts justified the decision saying America had changed. But Eric Holder, the first black Attorney General serving in the administration of America's first black president, Barack Obama, said it hadn't changed enough to gut the Voting Rights Act.
These problems have not been consigned to history. They continue to exist. Their effects are real. They are of today, not yesterday, and they corrode the foundations of our democracy.
Since 2013, dozens of states have moved to again limit ballot access, including the shutting down of polling places, expanding ID requirements, and purging voter registration rolls. During the coronavirus pandemic, the 2020 election saw a surge in early and mail-in voting, with over 66% of eligible American voters casting a ballot. That was up more than 6 points on 2016 and higher than previous peaks of 2008, 1960 and 1908. In fact, it was the best turnout for any year since 1900, when those Jim Crow laws were taking hold. The battle is now on to see if those COVID voting measures are made permanent under the new For the People Act or rolled back following false claims of voter fraud from defeated Republican President Donald Trump. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act aims to restore elements of the 1965 law stripped away by the Supreme Court in 2013, but both bills seem destined to fail in the US Senate unless another relic of the Jim Crow era, the filibuster, is finally overturned.
Please get together, break up this old Jim Crow.